Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third installment of the ANSER series on federalism. Today, I have the pleasure to welcome Sorabi Hudire, who is Research Assistant at the Harvard Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. She did her bachelor's in economics at Christ University in Bangalore and then pursued her master's at the Harvard Kennedy School. She is interested in technology and its use in the public service and public administration. But today, we will use her expertise on the Indian federalism. India is a multilingual, multicultural country and the largest federal state in the world. Thus, it provides an interesting case study for Belgium. Sorabi, welcome.
Thank you so much, Thomas, and thank you to the team at ANSER for thinking of me to present on India's long-lasting experiment, if I may say, with federalism. I'll very briefly sort of take you through what I think are important historical as well as factual ideas that need to be put forth in understanding India's interest with federalism, and happy to sort of open the conversation up to see how India's experience can give takeaways to what you're trying to do in Belgium. So just to give you a quick sort of
I will quickly interrupt you if that's okay. Just for viewers who are here for the first time, first Sorabi will give her presentation. Then we will follow by a discussion to compare the Belgium case to the Indian case. And lastly, we'll have a question and answer round. For your questions, you can submit these questions in the live chats on YouTube. Sorry to disturb you, Sorabi. The floor is yours again.
No worries. Thank you, Thomas. In the spirit of federalism, as much as this can be a conversation and Q&A, I think that's appreciated. So just to sort of lay the foundation over here, when India gained independence from British colonial rule in 1947, it was difficult to look at the borders and say this is India, because there was British India and there was all of these princely states that had been in some agreement with the colonial power. All of these entities had to come together to form what we know today as India. And that negotiation with the princely states is what kind of laid the foundation for what we know as federalism today in India. When our constitution makers sat together and discussed, how is it that a country that has so much diversity, and I try not to, I'm not going to exaggerate it, but that's what it is. 1.3 billion people. We have 22 official languages, and I would say about 19,500 dialects of different languages. And yeah, that get fit into 121 languages per se. This is per the census of my country. And it's true, the diversity is immense. Diversity in religion, diversity in culture, diversity in language. It's a challenge to govern. It's a challenge for a country such as this to have a national identity, a singular national identity. So when the constitution makers of India came together and said, how is it that we can allow for our political expression, our governance structure to not just treasure and enrich this diversity, but also have a national identity per se? The answer to that was to really think of a structure that would be in a way a constant negotiation. And I use the word constant negotiation with a lot of responsibility, because India's pitch to this conversation on federalism is cooperative federalism. Just to sort of backtrack a little bit, what is it that the constitution makers were really thinking about? The constitution makers have very clearly sort of articulated in Article 1, in fact, the very first article of our constitution, that India, that is Bharat, which is a civilizational name, is a union of states, as you can see on screen. Thank you so much, Thomas. So it confuses me often when I say India is a federal state, India is a unitary state. It's not. It's neither a federal state nor is it a unitary state. India is a union of states. India has all of these state government entities that do not have their own constitution, do not have a power to secede, but have certain powers within the Union of India. They come together within the Union of India. What we use in India is that we are a quasi-federal state. What does that essentially mean? That we have all of these federal entities. However, and there is a structure within which the states as well as the union government interact. However, the union government does have constitutional authority when, in terms of national security, in terms of crisis moments, as well as in the structure, the union government does have the upper hand. So this is India's pitch on federalism. This is how we balance our extraordinary diversity with forming of a national identity and pushing a national project. Thomas, if you can show the map that shows India's 28 states and 9 union territories. Again, you can see the different languages that, in the middle of the country, the focus is Hindi, and everywhere else there are different official languages. This is a challenge in itself. When you see the map, you'll realize that each of the southern states are linguistically divided, and this was a conscious sort of movement that happened post-independence, where there was a need to there was a question: how do we sort of divide our states, or how do we come up with these territories? And that question was answered through the linguistic sort of agenda. Whereas in the center of India, it is mostly Hindi, which is the official language, but there were differences in terms of culture and in terms of their national in terms of their regional identity that were clubbed. Many of them were princely states, so therefore they were put together in that sense. So this amalgamation of what you see in terms of linguistic boundaries, this is India. And I must say, every commentator on India who's looking at it both from outside as well as within is always perplexed as to how we've survived all these years when there is so much complexity and diversity going on. Again, I go back to the word cooperative federalism. It is a constant negotiation. How is it a constant negotiation? So we have 3 lists. Thomas, if you do have that, please do show us the 3 lists: the union list, the state list, and the concurrent list. What are these 3 different lists? These are policy matters that the different entities can legislate on. The union list is entirely for the union government. When I say union government, we have a parliamentary structure of government. Therefore, we have a lower house and an upper house, and either of these houses with differing powers can legislate on matters such as defense, atomic energy, so on and so forth, which you see are mostly national ideas and focused on national security, on the entire country in particular. Whereas the state list is a little bit more, is something that the state legislatures, each state legislature has a lower house. Some state legislatures also have an upper house. And these are subjects that are more pertinent for the state legislature to sort of legislate on. At the same time, there's also a concurrent list. I'd like you to think of these as the concurrent list in terms of a overlapping pie chart in some ways. So the concurrent list are subjects that both the union government as well as the state government can legislate on. And these are matters such as education that might need for a national consensus, but might also be necessary for the state government to have a very specific, nuanced view on it. So this is our pitch to cooperative federalism. I think the concurrent list particularly is a matter that there is a lot of negotiation. There's a lot of political negotiation that happens as to whether governments are, especially when political parties are differing in the state and the center, there are protests, there are consultations, it's really a living and breathing democracy in that sense. This is, I would say, this is the sort of backbone to what federal structure in India is. And I'm happy to sort of, I'm not sure how I'm doing on time. I have a few more minutes probably, but yes, Thomas.
You have a few more minutes if you want, yes.
Yeah, fantastic. I think the only other thing that I wanted to touch on in this introduction, I know this can be a lot of facts and a lot of very different from probably what the European experience is. But India's democracy, I think, has since the independence has matured to an extent where these processes and norms have built around what the constitution is able to provide. Now, I must mention that things do go terribly wrong at different times. In British India, we had the structure where the union could sort of come into a state or come into a territory and take control. That in some ways has become prevalent even in post-independent India, where if there is a state that is undergoing democratic transition or undemocratic transition, a state is unable to govern itself, there is an emergency situation, then the union government can step in and impose president's rule. It is unfortunate to say that, yes, there have been times where something like a president's rule, where the union stepping in becomes a matter of political play and not really from the governance perspective. At the same time, I would say the role of governor in India is supposed to mimic the governor, I think, from the British era. And the governor is a representative of the union in the state to ensure that things are seamlessly democratic. Whereas the governor sometimes becomes an impediment to democracy in itself. And this has been true both in the Congress era and unfortunately even in the present as well. So these are some difficulties that we face through this quasi-federal structure that we've come up with. But there is definitely this, like I said, a constant negotiation, not just in terms of specific policy, specific governance structures, a specific law, but also in the nature of the federal and quasi-federal state in itself. An interesting sort of snippet, because I come from the southern part of India. One of the thoughts that the constitution makers had when they were thinking about the need for a federal aspect to our governance was that India is economically also very, very diverse. We have inequality in certain states that surpass combined inequality in certain other states. Therefore, it became necessary in terms of the state structure for us to ensure that the economic sort of there is economic growth and development is more equal in different parts of the country. Therefore, the southern states are always complaining we're paying too much taxes that don't end up in our in our development, whereas that was necessary to pull the northern states, especially the states called Bimaru, or in Hindi dubbed as Sikh, Bihar, Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh, these states that had lower economic parameters. It was necessary for them to be supported. And that's an important aspect to our fiscal federalism and our economic federalism as well. Thomas, I'm going to hand it over to you from here on, and happy to sort of make this into a conversation with you and everybody at the ANSER team.
Surabi, thank you so much for that introduction. I will quickly already ask the first question that I have thought about. You talked about governors being representative of the union towards a different state, but this sounds to me like they're not really the head of the state within. So they're not really prime ministers, I assume, but how can I compare them? Are they like overseers to see if the local head of the local state does not surpasses its grounds, or has it another function?
Fantastic. Thank you for asking that question, Thomas. And I think these clarifications become so important.
I think we lost our speaker. We will wait a few seconds until it resumes. Who knows? My apologies. Yes, this can happen, of course, in internet times. Hopefully, we will be reconnected soon. Okay, perfect. Sorabi, welcome. Your voice is still turned off, so let's see.
Am I audible now?
Oh, okay, perfect. You can restart your answer from 0, and thanks again.
Yeah, my apologies. This is probably going to happen a little bit due to technical issues. But yeah, I was saying, Thomas, thank you so much for asking that question. I think it's important to clarify these smaller sort of nuances. So a state in India, like I said, does not have its own constitution. It does have its legislative bodies. Within these legislative bodies, some states have a upper house, some states do not, but every state has a lower house. The lower house is where is formed by an elected government, or rather elected members of the legislature, and each of these come together to elect a chief minister. So each state has a chief minister. The chief minister, I wouldn't say is the head of state per se. The chief minister is the head of the government, of the executive, and therefore they are the person that is taking executive decisions, and they have a cabinet of ministers, a council of ministers, so on and so forth. Now, this is mimicked in the national level as well, where a prime minister is elected and is the head of government, and the president is the head of state. Here we can use head of state, whereas in the state level we really can't. That's not, yeah. And in the governor per se is more of a ceremonial role, and holds the power of sort of overseeing the formation of government, overseeing if there is a moment of conflict, then the governor steps in to sort of take a decision on what is constitutionally right to be done, as well as the governor signs off on bills that are sent through the state legislature. But that is usually, it's more of a, it's not really, he doesn't, I'm saying he because my governor is he, but the governor does not have the right to sort of deny the passage of any bills or that have been approved by the state government, the state legislature. So yeah, this is how our process is sort of structured from that perspective.
Now I will feed back to the Belgium case, because maybe a comparison might be enlightening for all viewers. I was wondering, our regions, or you should say our substates, are built mostly on linguistic grounds or cultural grounds. Is this the same in India, or could it just be by hapstance? Because, sometimes in history, even one group of people can be divided over two borders. So what's the case in India? Is it especially linguistic, especially cultural, or mixed?
That's a tough question to answer. India's in all sort of, for all purpose and reasons, India is a linguistically divided sort of structure, but I can't say that every single state has its own specific homogeneous linguistic identity. Within my state, I'll give you an example. I come from Karnataka. Within my state was essentially formed by sort of putting together the erstwhile Mysore princely state. As I mentioned, a lot of India is princely states sort of patched together, right? The Mysore princely state spoke mostly Kannada, which is the language that I speak, but there were also a lot of people who spoke Tamil, Telugu. These are people who lived, or these are languages predominantly spoken in my neighboring states. So there is that. Within Kannada, there are multiple dialects. There is a northern Kannada dialect. There is another sort of, I wouldn't say Konkani is a part of Kannada, but there's a different sort of language that is spoken in the coastal areas. So it's difficult to say that in my Karnataka, everybody speaks Kannada. They don't. Everybody speaks a version of Kannada. Everybody speaks some kind of Kannada. Some people speak Tamil. Some people speak. So yes, we're linguistically those boundaries were linguistically thought of as much as possible. So I think from the Belgian experience, as much as I've learned in this, in my research, it might not be as stringent as the three languages and how they're divided. Again, this goes back to India's complexity and diversity within the language and cultural space. So yeah, does that answer your question, Thomas?
Oh,
I tried
yes,
my
yes,
best.
yes, very, very much so. And I was going to say I was afraid, but I'm not afraid of it, of course. But I thought it would be more complex than, of course, my question implied. In Belgium, we also have questions about changing those borders just because of these linguistic and cultural pressures. For example, Brussels is becoming more and more a dominated French-speaking region, and some even say that the borders, which lie entirely in the Dutch-speaking Flanders, are also becoming more and more francophone. So some argue that we should change the borders of these states. Is there a similar discussion going on in India, or these borders sanctimonious?
No, the borders are not sanctimonious. What is sanctimonious is the border that India shares with other countries, or rather, in the northern part with our neighbors, Pakistan, China, and Bangladesh. That is sanctimonious. And of course, our constitution does not allow for states to secede into their own independent entities. That is something that is protected against, and secession is seen as there are laws that protect against secession. However, within the territorial sort of integrity of India, there is all provision for states to be altered in consultation with both the states as well as with processes within the union government. The newest state to come into existence was Telangana. Telangana in southern India was the idea behind that. It was a very political sort of movement, and it always is. Sometimes it is a more governance-oriented position. States are huge to govern. They want a smaller entity. It's easier to govern. Now, when I say huge to govern, right, you should think about India's population and just the millions that sort of constitute it. And governance structures are overburdened, and therefore that becomes a reason. But that's less of a political decision. Whereas I think what would be more identifiable for the Belgian experience is when a group of people say that in Andhra Pradesh, where the Telangana movement started. So Andhra Pradesh is a southern state. They speak Telugu. But Telangana within the Andhra Pradesh region had its own distinct cultural identity and a long history of wanting to, be recognized as a separate sort of state. And the separate state Telangana movement has been violent, bloody. It's been incredibly difficult. It did not happen as easily. I'm not, I can share these dates with you, but it's been going on since the very beginning. I'd say about 1960s onwards. So the Telangana movement was primarily led by students in Telangana, who used to, as a form of protest, was lighting themselves up on fire. So, that was the very bloody, very violent movement. But yes, I don't know if I'm not saying that that's how movements should be, but that is India's history with sort of redrawing boundaries. It's not easy, but it happens.
This is very interesting because the Flemish fight, let's say, for more independence and the forming of the federal state was also started by student movement. So it shows that young people who are dissatisfied with the current affairs often have a bigger impact in the long run than people anticipate at the moment itself. Yeah, go ahead. No, you want to comment on it? Go.
No, I mean, I wouldn't want to turn this into a political sort of opinion in any way, but I do think that tends, yes, definitely young people have, when there is resentment and when there is dissatisfaction, have the capability to protest and bring about change, but also sometimes, political factors push for people who have least amount to lose. So I wouldn't, while I see that, I wouldn't, violent forms of protest and losing people for issues such as this is something that I'm definitely against.
Yes, I totally agree and understand. You said it was impossible for states to separate, but I assume, knowing India and some regions, that some groups do want to separate. Is there no way out? The past has shown that sometimes more separation, or let's say at least some more devolution, so the spreading out of certain powers, can ease the tension. So maybe a separation would not be possible, but maybe a transfer from powers from the union state to that certain state at a local level could help. Is that a possibility?
So this question would be most pertinent, I think, to the state of Jammu and Kashmir, because that is right now the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir, and so we had a new sort of legislation that broke the state of Jammu and Kashmir into Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir and Union Territory of Ladakh. This is something that sorry to sort of divert, but this is something that I forgot to mention. We have, as I mentioned, 28 state governments, and we have 9 union territories. Now, what are these 9 union territories? They are essentially where the union government, there is no state government, it is the union government's territory. It's as simple as that. But there are lieutenant governors who sort of that provide assistance in running the state or governing the state. There is an interesting case of the Union Territory of Delhi, which I think you can sort of see with Brussels in some ways, because the Union Territory of Delhi houses so many institutions of the union government as well as the state government. It is a special structure where there is a state government. The union government has powers on law and order, on certain other things, whereas the state government legislates on matters of education, healthcare, predominantly. So within our complicated federal structure, Delhi is a further complicated federal structure, a federal sort of entity, or rather a state government as well as a union territory entity, which is just, that would probably need an entire session in itself. But to come back to your question, Thomas, the concept of the integrity of India, the territorial integrity of India, is a very, very, how do I put it? It's a very sensitive topic because of the historical civilizational trauma that India has had to endure. We have been colonized multiple times. We have had invasions from multiple places. So for us, and colonization is a traumatic history. It's in the recent past. It is pervasive in all our institutions. It's pervasive in our memory. So we fought very hard for that independence, to be rulers of our own land. It didn't come easy. It came with a lot of sacrifice. It came with hundreds of years of movements that were shut down and rebuilt, and movements that demanded sacrifice from all people. I'm sure that there is knowledge and information on this, on the national movement. That national movement essentially built the national consciousness in some sense, that we fought for this territory, we've come together, we're trying to build a country, we're trying to build a nation. And an important takeaway from that was the land, was the territorial integrity. Therefore, secession from India is seen as, and not to mention, there was also partition, right? Which was a huge, huge event, the biggest displacement of humans ever between India and Pakistan and erstwhile East Pakistan. When India chose to be secular in its state, whereas Pakistan chose to be non-secular, India was, in some ways, we were opening ourselves up to absolutely anybody. And therefore, secession to us seems everybody has a place in India. And everybody contributes to what India is. Therefore, secession is not something. Now, when I say, I know your question was not necessarily about secession, but with the specific case of Jammu and Kashmir, it would be very interesting to sort of know the history. In the history of Jammu and Kashmir, so much has happened. Within this, so much, the negotiation that ensued between the union government and the state government, J&K actually had its own constitution. And there was a huge sort of political movement as well as a policy legislature in the last couple of years where that constitution was revoked. What happened with Jammu and Kashmir having its own constitution was that all the laws that were being made in India were not necessarily being implemented through, or J&K had to go through its own process. And in Indian constitution, a state having another constitution is not allowed. Whereas Jammu and Kashmir was given that because of the unique nature of the conflict there. But that has been revoked. Any law made in the Union of India is now applicable to Jammu and Kashmir as well. It didn't work for us. It didn't work in terms of that, different people can have different views on Jammu and Kashmir. This is my view, of course. But having a separate constitution, devolution of powers, increased militancy, or rather, I wouldn't say it was a correlation, but around this period, there was an increased amount of militancy. It did not lead to the solution that India was hoping for, which is for the complete integration of Jammu and Kashmir, as well as the Kashmiri people within India. Which is why now there is a different approach, and that approach has been that in letter and spirit, Jammu and Kashmir, Union Territory, as well as the Kashmiri people are an integral part of India.
Maybe continuing on the idea that there is basically this national movement that invokes also, I feel when I hear you, a national identity. And then I wonder, what is the role of national parties in invoking this idea that India is one whole?
That's a good question. I think, somewhere we have to talk about political parties and how that's structured. In the very beginning, of course, there was the Congress Party, the Indian National Congress. This is under Jawaharlal Nehru, and that it was a remnant of or rather, it was a continuation of some ways of the Indian National Congress that was led by Mahatma Gandhi, but this was a political entity and a political party registered as such. The Congress Party was dominating elections everywhere, so that there was only one party at one point in time. Slowly, opposition against the Nehru started, opposition against Indira Gandhi later on really solidified regional parties and regional movements. So the first opposition to the national sort of party was under the Janata Party, the JP movement. And with that, we saw that there were the Congress Party's dominance sort of lessening and lessening and lessening. At the same time, there are, when I say regional parties and national parties are those which have formed government in more than X number of states, whereas regional parties are specific to a particular state or particular region. So there exists multiple national parties. Some regional parties also become national parties, but there also exist in numerous, I have to pull up that number, but it's a fairly big number of regional parties that only cater to particular regions. National parties, there is no one way to answer your question, because each national party has its own pitch on what the idea of India is. Within each national party, there are different streams of ideas and thoughts on what the nation or the national identity constitutes. Within regional parties, certain regional parties, there's a negotiation. They want to advocate for their states. There is advocacy for the state. Some will not cross the line of India's integrity. Some do cross the line of India's integrity. So what is true in Manipur is not true in, Goa. What is true in Kashmir is not true in Kerala. So that's just how complex, and our political system is really the biggest, is probably the biggest confusion, I think, in some sense, that somebody can take away when they're studying India. I'm trying to think about how relevant this would be to the conversation on Belgium, but
I mean, very much, I would argue, in the sense that we're also linguistically divided. And for us, we always have this joke: what unifies us as a country? The national football team, the king, and French fries, which is not really something to call your unifying object. So
yeah,
I think we can definitely find some interaction. But maybe let's shift now away from this more, let's say, cultural approach to a more technical approach. So there's a bicameral system in India. And I wonder in what sense that this is important, because in Belgium, we also have the same system, but it has diminished in its importance. At first, it was only needed for big reforms, and now stricto sensu, it still is, but they're planning to phase it out and to eventually just let it go empty. So how is the case in India? Does it have an active role, this bicameral system? And what is the impact on the federal system?
I would say that definitely the bicameral system has a diminished role. Like I said, there are states that have a unicameral legislation, whereas only the bigger states have a bicameral legislation. And the idea behind that was the somewhat modeled when India was forming its own constitution. There were consultations as well as learnings from other parts of the world. A lot of it came from the United Kingdom, and it was modeled on the House of Commons and the House of Lords, which is one part of the legislation is focused on bringing people elected representatives, purely democratic sort of elections leading to the formation of the lower house, whereas the upper house consisted of people who were eminent members of society, who had done certain work in different fields and who could add that sort of value from their knowledge and experiences, etc. But as time has passed, it has become, especially in the states, this has just become a matter of the lower house continues to be the political center as well as the legislative center. The lower house also has more powers in terms of what type of bills they're able to legislate on, whereas the upper house does not have the power to legislate on money bills, does not have on the state's money bills, etc. So yeah, the sort of it has the role of the upper house has been diminished. In terms of how it plays out to the federal structure, I don't think it has that much of an impact. I don't believe that there is a direct sort of correlation between the bicameral structure as well as and the way cooperative federalism in India works. What I think plays more of an important role is the existence of bodies. So we had a planning commission. India was in some ways a socialist state. We had a federal or union planning commission that used to make yearly plans and 5-year plans, 10-year plans, so on and so forth. But now that has been replaced by an entity called the Niti Aayog, which is a consultative entity that is in some ways brings together the chief ministers of different states to have a consultation on matters that are relevant both to the state as well as union legislative topics. So that is this sort of, and the Niti Aayog is not it's not a statutory body. It's more of an entity within. I will have to check this up on the nuance of it, but the Niti Aayog serves as this sort of bridge between the union government and the state governments as a consultative committee. So the Niti Aayog consists of technocrats mostly, technocratic members who provide their advice, provide white papers, in some ways it's a think tank that's providing this bridge between the state government and the union government. So it's a new sort of experiment, and we're also figuring it out, I would say. But the bicameral structure does not necessarily have an impact.
Okay, just a quick follow-up question, because I assumed I heard correctly. This means that there's only this bicameral at the state level, but not at the union level?
No, the union definitely has a stronger bicameral structure. We have the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, the lower house and the upper house. In the state governments, in the states where there is a bicameral structure, the impact is diminished. Whereas in the union government, both the Rajya Sabha and the Lok Sabha have a good role to play, have a big role to play.
I have some questions coming in on the YouTube live chat, so it might be fun to look at them.
Sure.
So I have, just a bit too late. Alexander asks, what keeps India together? As Thomas mentioned, we have beer, fries, and football. Is there a president, the army, the religion, cricket? What is the key contribution to Indian togetherness?
That's a wonderful question that I believe is a constant question. I don't think there's an answer to it. The fact that it's a constant question is what keeps India alive. But yeah, we have Bollywood, we have cricket. These are national sort of religions, so as to say. We have a cultural thread that this is something that, of course, identity, our festivals, our belief systems, the fact that we are, there are multiple ideas on spirituality, on these aspects, definitely is a common thread. But there's really no one answer. You can ask one Indian, and probably they'll have multiple answers as to what keeps India together. And you ask another person, they'll have another bunch of answers. It's funny that Winston Churchill, when India gained independence, was convinced that we would last as one entity for, say, about a few years, and that we'd fall apart. And here we are, 7 decades later, somehow figuring it out.
I mean, we have the same thing, almost 200 years of Belgium in 2030, and we're also wondering, how has this experiment continued on for so long? Continue on. Josse asks, how is the constitution changed? By a simple 2/3 majority, or are there any protection for minorities, for example, linguistic or religious?
There is, yes, it's a 2/3 majority that requires in the lower house. There is, and ratification by the president, of course. That is a constitution, what a constitutional amendment sort of requires. But protection, I don't entirely understand the question, but I would say
maybe I can help. These protections are in Belgium, for example. We have two big linguistic groups, you could say, French-speaking and Dutch-speaking. And whenever, even also the German-speaking have this right, whenever a community feels that they are attacked and their basic rights, they can block it. And they can have a delay procedure to make sure that this procedure to reform the state doesn't continue on. So maybe similar exists in India.
Yes. In India, we have something called the basic structure of the constitution, which is the preamble and our fundamental rights. So the basic structure of the Constitution has more due process, or is the fundamental sort of thing that cannot be altered. And I'm happy to elaborate more on that. But the gist of it is that while it's not focused essentially only on a group of people, it helps protect the very sort of nature of our state and our constitution, that equality should be protected, freedom of speech should be protected. These sort of ideas are protected through the basic structure of the Constitution. Whether there's a redressal mechanism, yes. And I forgot to mention this through our conversation, that one of the things which really sort of hold the democracy together is not just the institution of legislature, but also the judiciary, and how there is a balance of powers between both the executive, the judiciary, as well as the legislature, and the balance of powers that exist between all of these institutions across different states. So this is the protections that have been inbuilt into the Constitution or inbuilt into our state processes, even if it's not. So that sort of negotiation, as I mentioned, that constantly happens for particular marginalized groups, happens for particular minority groups. I may give one example, which is that India, as you know, has a caste-based hierarchy that has, that has been the Constitution does sort of provide protections for those who have faced caste discrimination, and that is through reservations. So that's another sort of part of the Constitution that allows for something like this.
I'm very happy that you bring up the caste system, because I want to ask a question not specific on that, but more on the question of identity. What does a generic Indian feel more identifiable with? Its city, its region, its state, maybe its caste, like you now mentioned. What do you think drives? Or is it like some people say here in the West, we have multiple identities? I am a European outside of Europe. I'm a Belgian within Europe. What is your view?
Yes, this definitely has to be primarily my view, because it's difficult to articulate for anybody else. I think that the identities, yes, there are multiple identities, and India is flawless at sort of having multiple identities. I can say within my state, I definitely identify as a Kannadiga, that is my language, but my Indian identity surpasses that very strongly. I also identify as Hindu, so that is my religious or faith identity. Caste or jati varna, as we call it, is an identity that is for some, it's for some it is incredibly pronounced, for some it's not. In electoral system, again, it's at times it's extremely pronounced, at times it's not. I know that there is so much that I'm saying that it can go this way or that way, but the truth is that is our pitch, which is very inherent in our culture, that you can believe in X, Y, Z and you'll still get, you'll still reach heaven or so-called heaven. That is the way we think of the world, which is that there really is no one path. And to have your own belief and have your own identity is very encouraged. And so therefore there are multiple people who believe that their caste is the biggest identity. There are multiple people who believe that their national identity surpasses. Now, how do you measure something like this, right? At the end of the day, that's a tricky question, because either it's rhetoric or it becomes, specific stories. How do you measure something like this? I think the easiest or the nearest way for us to measure something like this is electoral behavior and political participation. So there was a time in India through the when the Mandal Commission report came out, and I don't want to go into the history of it, but just know that there was this legislation that was that created special reservations for a certain set of people from particular caste, and that negotiation led for the country to vote in a more caste-centric manner. So the caste identity stood out when elections came across. Whereas now that has fast forward to 2014, or fast forward even to 2004 onwards, that identity, caste identity in terms of electoral behavior has been diminishing more towards a national or cultural identity in some way. So what is the idea of India that one thinks of when they vote? So it's become in some ways more nuanced. It's not as simple as this person goes, is from my caste and therefore I vote for them. But that continues as well. That is not completely done. Electoral tickets continue to be given based on caste. So that is an important, again, another important possible measure. So yeah, these are the different identities that exist. And this is true for anybody who has possibly visited India or has, there is no one, which I'm sure is true for every single country and every single region, but gets very, very exaggerated in India because of the diversity, not just in language, in religion, within religion, and cultural experiences, climate, economy, all of these.
Okay, very well. It is a great segue to my follow-up question. Elections, how do elections work? I mean, you're the largest democracy in the world, but we don't even know which system do you use. Do you use the British first past the post system with only one candidate per subscriptor? Is it different?
Yes, yes, we use the first past the post system, however flawed it is. And of course, there's been voices to change that to more of a proportional given how diverse we are. But we use first past the post system. We have an election commission, both in the center as well as the state level election commissions. We run the world's largest democratic exercise, which is done in a phased manner. So not all of India votes on the same day. We vote in different days. We use electronic ballots. We don't use paper ballots. We have moved towards electronic ballots. So that there is no restriction on the number of parties. Therefore, there is no restriction on the number of candidates. You can stand as a part of a particular party. You can stand as a part of as an independent as well. So that's for a particular constituency. So India allows for anybody to stand for elections, but in reality is that it's usually those who have a political party backing that are able to succeed in electoral politics.
This is fascinating. I would have never guessed that you would do digital voting. We also use computer voting. So
it's not really digital voting. It's I would say mechanical voting.
Okay.
Yes.
Well,
yes.
Explain then. Explain.
So essentially, the ballot boxes are in themselves a mechanical entity that you carry to different parts of the country, and you press on a particular button that gets recorded, and then that is manually counted. The electoral box is brought back to one particular area in a constituency or a district, and that is manually counted by a human being with people from different parties overseeing the counting. So it's not necessarily digital in the sense that you press a button and it gets recorded and you see the results. It's more of you press a button, it gets recorded, somebody counts it, somebody verifies it, and then the results are out.
Okay, I see. I guess this was my follow-up question. I thought, how do you do this for rural parts? But of course, you just explained. They just bring it along these boxes.
Forget rural areas within forests where there are populations of tribals or forest dwellers. In the remotest possible locations in India, there is an elections happen. There is no part of India that does not.
This is a miracle. This is really a miracle.
It truly is.
Oh, it's fantastic. I'll quickly go back to the YouTube feed to see if there's new questions coming in. I have a long one by Quinton. Quinton asks, are there federal powers that are exercised asymmetrically by the federal government? I don't understand exactly what he means, but I'm reading on. I am talking about the federal government pursuing different policies between the different parts of the country without transferring the powers to the region. Okay, now I do understand.
That's an interesting question. Yes, first and foremost, I think, one of the things that confuses me as a student from India who's studying abroad, we don't use federal government, we use union government, because it's not really a bunch of states who come together to form a government in the center level or federal level. It's more sort of top down in some way. So we use union government, and the union government does, yes, there is that. There are these provisions. For example, if I may say, in my state, there are special sort of buckets of legislation that are particularly relevant to water relations between my state and another state. So I wouldn't say that union government passes a law and that is different for one state to the other. There are provisions that are made to sort of take in the diversity. But the state governments have the capability to implement and change in accordance to their needs and requirements. So that is of a union legislation. If a state is legislating, it is up to the state as to what they legislate. But the union necessarily does not. So let me just go a little deeper, right? How are laws written? At the end of the day, the law in itself is going to be a sort of guiding principle or a boundary within which the rules are made. The rules of what the law is are made. And those rules are made specific to specific contexts. So the union government doesn't necessarily say, okay, for this to be implemented, X has to be done and Y has to be done. And therefore, this is rigid and this is how it needs to be. The rules sort of build in and then allow for flexibility in implementation. And the state government makes its own rules for multiple union laws. So it's not, yes, one law can be implemented and interpreted different ways across the country. That happens. The union government can also create, like I said, special bodies or special laws for particular regions, like, for example, in my region, the water issue. So yeah, I hope this answers the question. I can think a little bit more and try to be more specific, but that was a good question.
It was. I was very happy to read it. So maybe a question from my part. Let's then change it around. Does the union government retain veto right to state laws? So, there's no local constitution, so you might think that they can always vote it off if they say this is not in the interest of India as a whole.
Yes. So first and foremost, state will not, if a state government is legislating against any provision of the constitution, that will be scrutinized in the High Court of the state. So the state judiciary has the capability to sort of step in at that point in time. Because at the end of the day, the judiciary is the interpreter of the constitution. So the state government cannot necessarily legislate against provisions in the constitution. And that will be scrutinized by the High Court. Go ahead, Thomas.
This I understand, but I mean more in a political manner. Sometimes, let's say, for example, sentiments of political independence. Some states might actually go against the total national sentiment, which would be great for the state, perhaps, but bad for India as a whole. And then at the political choice, the union might say, no, this goes way against our interests.
Well, structurally, there's no such provision for the union government to step in. The other way that they, like I said, they can step in is through the governor. The governor refuses to sign a bill. That's if there's a question on territorial integrity or these constitutional matters, then the governor can step in. Sometimes it becomes a political negotiation as well. But no, if I were to answer your question specifically, if the national sentiment is for something, whereas the state government is legislating in a different direction, can the union step in? No.
Okay, fair enough. Let's see. Going back to YouTube. This is also an interesting one. You have mentioned before, Surabhi, that elections are phased in, so not the whole country has elections at the same time. And so we have a viewer, Gilles, who asks, are the results of the asymmetrical elections communicated at the same time? What with exit polls? Can't they influence the voting behavior in other states that are following soon?
Exit polls are so there are certain. Let me answer the question one by one. So essentially, we have a phased election process for. So there are union government elections to elect the members to the Lok Sabha. That should happen once in 5 years. So therefore, it's 5-year terms. The last one was 2019, and the next will be 2024. This is to elect members of the Lok Sabha, and the Lok Sabha members will then, whoever has the majority, will elect the Prime Minister. That's how our Prime Minister is elected, not directly, but through indirect election. The Lok Sabha election, because the country is huge, happens in different phases. The election results are announced on the same day. The exit polls are not allowed to be broadcast until all votes have been cast. So that sort of creates buffer in terms of how it influences the vote. Same process mimicked in state. When state elections happen, if it's a big state, it usually takes a few more phases, whereas if it's a smaller state, then it happens in one phase, the elections, and counting happens on one day, and results are announced in that one day. Sometimes it takes more than a day, depending on the logistical sort of things, but mostly within the day, the counting completes, and exit polls are not announced or allowed to be announced unless all of the votes have been cast. So the Election Commission in India is pretty stringent about these rules, and there are heavy fines and heavy sort of, but of course, there's also the flip side, which is that we deal with a lot of corruption in politics. We deal with a lot of corruption in elections and bribery and money. There's a lot of cash and violence, and these things happen. So continuing sort of fight. But yes, how elections continue to be, or rather voting continues to be influenced by factors such as alcohol, money, violence, guns. These are things that continue to sort of really play a big role. But structurally, at least institutionally, there are attempts at that being reduced as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Surabhi. We will slowly close the evening. I want to thank you very much for your nice thoughts about this conversation on federalism. You are a great guest. If you want some concluding remarks, please go ahead.
I think in terms of concluding remarks, I'd just like to say that my biggest sort of takeaway from the federal structure and the cooperative federalism that exists in India is making sure that there are checks and balances across different institutions and across different entities. That one, absolute power corrupts absolutely is so true. And therefore, not only should there be distribution of power between entities within
I think we have.
true. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think you have been cut off temporarily. So can you repeat the last 10 seconds? It was about.
Sure. My apologies. I was just going to say that I think these checks and balances are integral, not just checks and balances to ensure that both, as per country context, and union government as well as a state government are participating, but to ensure that the very nature of that participation is democratic. So every institution should have checks and balances, and I think that really is the fundamental to having strong democratic institutions.
Okay, thank you so much for being here, Surabhi. To our viewers, thank you for listening. Our next event is on the 12th of July. We will discuss federalism in Canada, again at 8 p.m. Central European Time, following live on YouTube.